Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to a deep dive.
Today, we're tackling a figure who has undeniably seized global attention, Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. He's complex, definitely controversial, and he really represents some significant shifts happening in African geopolitics right now.
Absolutely. And we've got quite a stack of sources here. Articles, research papers, notes, all digging into his, well, pretty rapid rise, his policies, and the intense debate that's constantly swirling around him.
Yeah, so our mission in this deep dive is really to try and cut through some of that noise. We want to pull out the most important sort of nuggets of knowledge from these sources to help you understand what's actually going on with Traoré and, crucially, why it matters.
Think of this as your briefing, basically, a comprehensive look at a pivotal moment in African leadership in sovereignty, tailored just for you from the material provided.
Ready? Please jump in.
So first off, who is Captain Ibrahim Traoré? How did this, 37-year-old military leader end up in power in Burkina Faso? The sources tell us he seized control in a coup that was September 2022.
Right. And before that, he wasn't exactly a household name, was he? Not outside certain military circles, anyway.
Yeah.
He seems to have risen very, very quickly from being a relatively obscure soldier to, well, head of state in just a few weeks.
Yeah, it's quite the trajectory.
But what's truly striking when you look through these sources, it isn't just the coup itself. It's how quickly and how deliberately an icon seems to have been crafted around him. He's become this really potent symbol for a lot of people in parts of Africa. They see him as someone standing up against, perceived Western influence and maybe the failings of traditional democratic systems.
And his image is key to that, isn't it? It seems very carefully managed. You almost always see him in that signature red beret and military fatigues.
Exactly. Some sources even talk about a developing cult of Saint Traoré, with his image just pushed relentlessly across social media.
Wow.
Yeah. And the sources highlight how this whole narrative building uses, well, everything, including potentially completely fabricated content like that AI-generated video you mentioned.
Oh, the R. Kelly one?
Right, yeah, featuring a digitally created version of R. Kelly who's, in prison, supposedly singing God Protect Ibrahim Traoré. That video, even though it's totally fake, apparently they got millions of views.
That's incredible. It shows the power of that kind of messaging.
It really does. It shows the emotional resonance and the techniques being employed.
And it's strange how that mixes with genuine moments too. Real footage of him playing football goes viral, but then right alongside it, you get these completely debunked claims, like him being behind some low-cost housing project that was actually somewhere else entirely, Algeria, I think.
Right. And you see supporters, including some controversial figures mentioned in the sources, just jumping to his defense immediately whenever allegations surface.
So this mix, this blend of real actions and crafted narrative, it's central to understanding his appeal and maybe these broader shifts in Africa.
I think so. It really highlights how potent political messaging and even disinformation have become in shaping how leaders are perceived today, especially, on a continent that's grappling with its political identity.
So why should you care about this icon status?
Well, because, as the sources underline, this rise isn't just about one guy. It's kind of emblematic of how power and influence are being built and perceived now in the digital age, and it reflects these deeper ideological currents.
Okay, so moving beyond the image, this is where it gets really interesting, right? Traoré's government, it seems to have made a very sharp break from the traditional post-colonial order, especially with France.
A very sharp break, yeah. He's positioned himself quite clearly as a champion of anti-corruption, economic self-reliance, and absolute national sovereignty.
And it's not just rhetoric, is it? The sources lay out some pretty concrete steps, like back in February 2023, ordering the French troops out, the ones there, as part of Operation Sabre.
Exactly. And the feeling on the ground, according to some sources, was that their presence just wasn't effective against the extremist threat anyway. So that was a big move.
And then dropping French as an official language, that's a huge symbolic statement.
And massive. And then pulling Burkina Faso out of ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, declaring that the whole regional body was basically too subservient to France.
He has some incredibly strong language, too, like that quote from the Russia-Africa summit.
Yeah, a slave who cannot assume his own revolt does not deserve to be pitied. Very direct.
And the sources say this kind of rhetoric really resonates, especially with younger Africans who feel perhaps disillusioned with external interference and see those traditional Western approaches, particularly from France, as paternalistic or just ineffective.
Yeah, and this pivot It really reflects a wider trend we're seeing across the Sahel region. You have military governments in places like Mali and Niger also actively rejecting those traditional Western partnerships.
Why now, though? What's driving it?
Well, the sources suggest it's partly fueled by a perception that, democratic systems in many parts of Africa haven't really delivered the improvements people expected. And in some cases, democratic governments themselves have been seen as corrupt or ineffective.
Right, so that leads to declining public trust and maybe more openness to military rule if it promises stability or, actual progress.
Potentially, yes. And the sources also flag this perceived hypocrisy from some Western nations, supporting certain autocrats when it suits them, while condemning leaders like Traoré.
Which creates an opening, right?
Exactly. It creates fertile ground for alternative powers to step in and gain influence.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? It sounds like a fundamental recalibration of strategic alliances, a really clear assertion of national sovereignty in the region, challenging that long-standing France-Afrique sphere of influence.
That's a good way to put it, a fundamental recalibration.
Okay, so beyond the political break, Traoré's government is also pushing these aggressive economic reforms, particularly in the mining sector.
Yeah, and this is crucial because Burkina Faso is incredibly rich in natural resources,
Yeah.
gold primarily. It makes up something like 75% of its export earnings.
Wow, that's huge.
It is. And the government's core argument, as it's presented in the sources, is basically that the historical deals, the arrangements for extracting this wealth, they just haven't properly benefited the Burkinabe people.
So they're pushing for more state control, this resource nationalism idea.
Exactly. That's the term they use.
Yeah.
They see the gold as the national patrimony, something that belongs to the nation.
And they've taken some pretty bold steps, haven't they? Creating a state-owned mining company, Sopamib.
Yes, Society of Mines of Burkina Faso. The stated goal is to eventually acquire foreign-owned operations. And they've already gone as far as nationalizing two major gold mines, Bongu and Wanyun.
And those were significant producers.
Very. Together, they produced about 20% of the country's industrial gold output back in 2023. So it's not insignificant.
The sources also mention a revised mining code. What's in that?
Well, it includes things like mandatory employment quotas for nationals, giving preference to local procurement, increasing royalty rates the companies have to pay, and expanding the state's right to participate, aiming for like 30–50% government ownership in future mining projects.
And the goal is to funnel that money.
Directly into the national treasury, to fund security, which is a massive issue, and development. That's the explicit aim.
What's interesting, though, is the government claims that since Traoré took power, the poverty rate has dropped slightly, maybe 2%, and state gold collection is up.
They do make those claims. However, the sources are pretty quick to add a caveat, especially on the gold collection figure. It seemed to combine both artisanal small-scale informal mining and industrial output, and there isn't really full transparency on the operational efficiency of the state-run aspect, so it's hard to verify or make direct comparisons.
Got it. And there was also something about a national gold reserve.
Yes, that's historically significant. The sources say they established the country's first national gold reserve in February 2025. The target is pretty ambitious, accumulating 50 tons by 2030.
Why? What's the point of that?
The stated goal is building economic independence, making the country more resilient to external shocks. They've reportedly set up a dedicated secure facility in Ouagadougou just for this purpose.
And connecting this to the bigger picture, you mentioned Mali and Niger earlier.
Right. Burkina Faso's approach seems to be part of that regional pattern. Mali and Niger are also moving to increase state control over their natural resources, trying to rewrite those economic relationships with traditional Western partners. They see it as pushing back against what they perceive as, neo-colonial extraction.
Okay, so this break from the West, it's happening alongside a strategic courtship of new partners. Russia seems to be the most prominent one mentioned in the sources.
Definitely the most prominent. He's been hosted by President Putin at the Kremlin, and sources document the presence of Russian paramilitary forces. Some identify them as the Bear Brigade, providing security for Burkinabe officials.
And Russia reopened its embassy, too.
Yeah, in Ouagadougou in 2023, after being closed for 30 years. That's quite symbolic.
Does this relationship extend to the economy as well, like the mining sector?
It does. A Russian company, Nordgold, was awarded a major mining license in March 2025. And the sources describe the terms as being more favorable to the state, including 30% government ownership. It seems linked to the security cooperation.
So how do people interpret this move towards Russia?
Well, supporters argue it's a smart play. Diversifying allies gives them more flexibility, lets them get security help without the political strings often attached to Western aid.
But the critics, what are their concerns?
The critics, according to the sources, raise some serious flags. They warn that Traoré's narrative building, combined with the Russian partnership, might echo tactics used before by groups like Wagner, aimed at destabilizing regions and undermining Western influence. There's a definite worry this can just be swapping one form of foreign control for another.
But do the sources suggest these African states are just pawns?
No, actually. They also caution against assuming these countries lack agency. The suggestion is they're making calculated decisions based on what they see as their own interests, even if the long-term outcomes are, well, uncertain.
And this isn't just Burkina Faso acting alone, right? This
No.
alliance of Sahel states, the AES.
Exactly. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger forming the AES. It signals a very deliberate shift away from those Western-aligned regional groups like ECOWAS towards creating a new bloc, a resource-rich bloc that seems increasingly aligned with powers like Russia and potentially China.
And this is happening as French influence seems to be waning across the region significantly. The sources highlight the broader trend. French military withdrawals from Mali, Niger, Chad, Senegal, Ivory Coast. It marks a real reduction in French influence and has pushed many countries to look for new partners. Russia, Turkey, the Gulf states, China, India.
It really does raise that central question, which the sources explore from different angles. Is Traoré genuinely forging a path for African independence by playing the field in this multipolar world? Or is he, maybe unintentionally, just substituting one foreign dependency for another?
And the sources present arguments for both possibilities without really landing definitively on one side. It's complex.
Okay, so despite this powerful revolutionary image, the bold reforms we've talked about, Traoré's rule is facing some pretty significant challenges and criticisms, isn't it, according to the sources?
Oh, absolutely. Domestically, the security situation is still frankly dire. Burkina Faso is often described as the epicenter of West Africa's worsening security crisis.
And the government doesn't control the whole country. Reports suggest they control less than half the territory. And there have been claims of foiled coup attempts against Traoré himself. So stability is a major issue.
And while some observers might see his actions as, a legitimate rejection of exploitative systems, maybe a leader finally putting Africa first. The critics point squarely at the non-democratic nature of his regime.
Yeah. Sources detail accusations of autocratic power consolidation, a crackdown on dissent, restrictions on media, on civil society groups.
And the elections he promised.
He initially promised them within 2 years of the coup, but those seem to keep getting pushed back. That's a major point of criticism.
However, some sources provide important context here, don't they? Emphasizing that this isn't a stable, liberal democracy we're talking about.
Exactly. They describe it as a war zone, facing an extremely serious security threat, even assassination attempts against Traoré. And some argue that this severe context might, unfortunately, necessitate limitations on certain freedoms that you wouldn't accept elsewhere. It's a difficult balance.
And what about the economic risks, the nationalization strategy?
There are concerns raised in the sources there too, mainly about maintaining operational efficiency in those mines without foreign expertise. And also the potential difficulty in attracting future investment if companies feel insecure.
Do they compare it to other historical examples?
Some sources do, drawing parallels to maybe controversial cases where nationalization led to production declines. But the government itself points to more successful models of resource management, like maybe Botswana, as their inspiration. And Western companies have definitely voiced concerns about investment security and clear compensation after nationalizations.
So when you look at all these different facets pulled from the sources, the bold reforms, the carefully engineered public image, the geopolitical pivot, but also the very real criticisms and security challenges, what aspects really stand out most to you?
Well, we've certainly taken the deep dive into the sources you provided on Captain Ibrahim Traoré.
Yeah, and we've definitely seen a figure who is, well, undeniably polarizing. He's presented by supporters as this populist savior almost, while critics view him much more as an opportunistic strongman.
Right, and his rise is just woven into this incredibly complex tapestry of dynamics, isn't it? You've got the dramatic rejection of the post-colonial status quo, this strong assertion of resource sovereignty, the pivot towards new global powers like Russia.
But also these immense domestic challenges, the severe security crisis, and real concerns about democratic freedoms.
Exactly. And his story, it really does reflect these broader, maybe fundamental shifts happening Right across Africa, historical relationships are being questioned, old alliances are being reevaluated, and new international partnerships are being forged in what's clearly a rapidly changing global landscape.
So looking at all this, what does it ultimately mean? It feels like the jury is still out.
Very much so. Whether Traore's bold and definitely controversial approach will genuinely lead to sustainable development and true sovereignty for Burkina Faso, or if it risks creating new kinds of dependencies, maybe further internal instability, that's a story still very much unfolding. We just don't know the ending yet.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you to consider as you process everything we've unpacked in this deep dive. In this current era, with all these global power realignments happening, is the rise of figures like Ibrahim Traoré almost an inevitable response? A response to perceived historical injustices, to these demands for real sovereignty, and what does it ultimately signal about the future shape of international partnerships across the African continent? Something to chew on.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.